Hello all, good morning, good afternoon. Before we jump into IBP topic, right, from process perspective, if we try to have a look at overall planning processes, we'll focus on this type of planning flow. So on the left side, we see some of the processes could be tactical, some could be mid-term operational, and some could be short-term operational. And then we have an execution part associated with it. When we talk about sales and operations planning as an overall supply chain planning process, you would see it would be a tactical supply chain planning process, which would cover horizontally part of demand. So you can say part of demand planning, combination of demand review process, supply planning associated with supply review process, so that you understand the forecast prediction, review at the different levels within the stakeholders of the organization, pass that demand signal to supply so that a rough cut capacity planning can happen and you get a feedback on the supply constraints, right? We review it together with stakeholders during supply review cadence and followed by inventory reconciliation and management business review, right? In earlier days, it used to call it as IR MBR process. In a simpler term, you can also call it as a pre-S&OP and final S&OP process. Right? So the horizontal block, which is visible here, is nothing but your S&OP. Right? So every organization carries out this S&OP process with a specific cadence. It could be all the stakeholders are responsible to collaborate together, do a demand review, do a supply review, and carry out this demand and supply balancing to come up with the final consensus. Right? Simple definition. This consensus will also need to be aligned with your financial projections, right? So in that way, you will see S&OP is not only about planning team. It covers stakeholders from different departments within an organization, part of demand, part of supply, even inputs from marketing team, sales team are reviewed, and then also those projections are aligned with the finance. So the key finance stakeholders are your supply chain director as well as finance director. Okay. When we'll get into IBP, we will focus how we will manage and create a solution within IBP for handling these processes. If I'm a supply chain planner, probably covering different departments, how I as a planner utilize IBP to carry out my S&OP. So there can be different roles created in IBP to execute those different tasks, right? Maybe Venkatesh is from demand team, so he's responsible to look at the sales history, predict forecast, and update the unconstrained demand plan in the tool. Whereas OS is from the supply team, who is responsible to look at that demand and carry out the net requirement calculation and identify the bottlenecks within the supply chain. The bottleneck could be because of the resource bottleneck, a work center or machine availability. It could be a labor availability, right? Or it could be related to capacities of combination of both. And then during the collaborative discussions, we will align whether the consensus demand or unconstrained demand identified by the demand team can be met or not. What are the following actions that need to take place in order to finalize or achieve this long-term or mid-term forecast, right? How do I do that in a system? Is managed in IBP, right? On the left side, you also see there is an input coming from your financial team. In earlier days, you used to have separate systems called as SAP BPC. There are additional tools, non-SAP tools also available where finance team carries out their revenue projections, right? So supply chain team is more focused on the quantity calculations, whereas the input coming from finance team would be always in terms of revenue, right? In terms of US dollars, you can say. In other words, it is also called as calculation of annual operating plan. So sometimes you may hear these terms called as AOP calculation, which is more of a financial term being used during the S&OP discussions. Do not hesitate to stop me, guys, in between. And if you have any questions or any pointers during for that specific topic, let's cover it there itself. Additionally, you may also have inputs coming from your marketing team looking at the possible opportunities, possible promotions which are being planned, which will definitely influence your demand generation. So those inputs come from marketing team, your product portfolio managers, your brand managers, right? It could be at a SKU level, or even it could be at an aggregated level of brands, product family, and so on. Those inputs will be anyway disaggregated at an SKU level and will be used during those demand reviews. That means in IBP, you need a possibility to input such kind of inputs coming from different stakeholders, right? We probably people who have not seen IBP would also be having a doubt what kind of screen will be available to visualize all this information, right? So in short, it is a tabular information in the Excel format, which would show, let's say, a marketing input for this material, for this customer, for in this month, right? So you would have information about master data fields like material, material description, customer, customer country, and so on. You would have information in terms of months where you would like to have a input as a focus quantity, right? It could be a marketing focus quantity as a placeholder. I'll move to the midterm to midterm operational or a second level of tactical process, which is actual calculation of your demand planning. So there will be a dedicated demand planning team who is responsible to generate statistical forecast and pass this demand as one of the input in the demand review meeting. So again, Venkatesh being a demand manager or demand planner is responsible to look at the sales history, look at the patterns within that sales history, identify which could be a suitable statistical forecasting algorithm, and generate statistical forecast based on the past sales. I take a pause. Venkatesh, you have a question? Please go ahead.
Yeah, Sam. So in this tactical planning, the horizon is 1 to 3 years, right? So this is done generally in the beginning of the year and only reviewed like beginning of the next year, like how the plan was performed, or like what is the frequency of the review process, or like when they would do this in the tactical planning.
Yeah, good question, Venkatesh. I think I missed out that point when I said there are different cadence within S&OP process. Some organizations carry out this entire process of demand review, supply review, and 3 SNOP as well as SNOP every month. Meaning, if we are in September now, they decide a cadence of, let's say, first 7 working days will be dedicated to cover this demand review, supply review, and final SNOP. And end of 7th working day, I should be aligned with all stakeholders. What should be my consensus or constraint demand for from current month onwards till next 3 years, right? There is a if there is a need and if there is a real situation where the demand signals may get changed every month, there is a need to look at these demands every month. Only for such business scenarios, those organizations carry out this S&OP cycle every month. However, there are organizations which says there are not many fluctuations within demand every month for us, right? The demand is quite stable. There is no need to have this monthly cadence. In such cases, they adopt either quarterly or half yearly review. Tactical planning process, I haven't seen any review happening once a year. It is more related to long-term forecasting or strategic planning process. But tactical planning, as you rightly asked, most of the time, even SAP based practice also indicates it's a once a month review. Most of the organizations carry out once a month. But some organizations I have seen carrying it out quarterly or even 6 monthly.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Again, in that way, demand planning would also be carried out once a month. The demand planner would be responsible to look at the sales history, generate the statistical forecast, remove any outliers within the sales history, which may negatively influence the statistical forecasting, right? So that you want to have an accurate baseline forecast which can be provided to the demand review. So that's why you see an arrow here from demand planning, input goes to a demand review, right? During the tactical planning process. Again, you may also say that my sales representative, my country heads are responsible to come up with their sales targets. So that can also be one of the input coming into S&OP discussions. I normally do not rely only on the statistical forecasting, but additionally, we encourage our sales team to talk to our distributors, get the idea on the current inventory lying at the distributors, how much would be the additional forecast coming from their side, and provide that high level view to us during the demand review. So again, sales planning team would be responsible to update that sales forecast, and that will be also passed back to demand review process. So during demand review, you would also see it's not only a demand planner who or demand manager who is participating. There are marketing team representatives, sales team representatives, product portfolio representatives attending those demand reviews and debating on the consensus numbers. Right? And that's where you would normally see what's different here, right? We are talking about process a lot. Whereas we being an SAP consultants, we were more focused on the configurations and executions of those transactions in SAP system. And I'm hardly talking about any transactions or system discussion so far. I'm trying to emphasize on the process. If this process gets comfortable with you, you will be able to also drive such kind of S&OP discussions as a business community member, right? So this will also give us opportunity to think about what happens exactly in the supply chain cadence, and if I get an opportunity, how I can also play those roles. Some organizations would also go one level down. They may say that in the shorter term, normally I carry out my demand forecasting in a monthly bucket, but I would like to know in which week I should have a realistic forecast, right? At times, as a thumb rule, organizations may say that I would like to have forecast in the first week of the month or last week of the month, where normally my most of the sales order come in the last week of the month. So let's put a forecast last week of the month. However, some organizations also like an automated way to identify this demand variation. And that's where SAP brought up this module called as demand sensing, which looks at the pattern of your sales orders and guide you to split your forecast in specific weeks. So there is a dedicated module available in demand sensing, which will help you to derive this weekly level forecasting or even at a daily level forecasting if there is a need, right? Industry like dairy industry, probably you may say that I would like to go ahead with the demand sensing calculations at a daily level and then pass this input again back to my demand review or demand planning process. Right. So if you look at demand, if you want to focus on demand side of SAP, you focus on demand planning and you can also get more exposure to the demand sensing models. Once these demand signals are finalized, then the next sub process would be supply planning. Any calculate the replenishment plan and try to identify if there are any bottlenecks, right? From the material availability or resource or machine availability perspective. To do that, I may also require to calculate my safety stocks, right? We know we are not living in an ideal world. There are always demand variations. If I do not have a good forecasting mechanism, and if I get a random ad hoc demand, I may lose those demands if I do not have sufficient inventory available in my warehouses. To cover such demand variations, I would always like to have some buffer inventory in my channel, which is called as a safety stock, right? In olden days, when we used to work with MRPs, we used to calculate safety stock in a simpler way. One option could be based on your experience, you decide the static safety stock quantity level. Every time, at least I would like to have 100 pieces of safety stock as my additional inventory. That's a static safety stock. Another way could be look at the demand of future weeks and try to keep the buffer stock equal to at least next 2 weeks of my demand or average of next 2 weeks of my demand. That could be another way of time managed safety stock, right? So SAP said when SAP moved these algorithms into APO and now into IBP, they said we will also give you some optimized ways of calculating the safety stock mechanism. And then they introduced this isolated module called as inventory optimization. Again, it's a bit of complex algorithm logic within the SAP, where safety stock can be calculated based on the demands, demand visibility in next weeks or next months, or it can also have some advanced level of safety stock calculation looking at the forecast error, right? Because as you may rightly indicate that time-phased safety stock calculation, just looking at the demand, also carries some possibility of demand error. As you mentioned, Rohit, for few organizations, there are huge demand variations, and that's why you may encounter forecasting errors. Now, how do I consider that forecasting error also as part of my safety stock calculation? So SAP has also come up with the advanced safety stock calculation logic, right? So safety stock calculation will be also one of the input for supply review. Post that, I can also generate my supply planning and come up with my replenishment plan results. Those supply plan results would be also discussed in my supply review, and my demand and supply balance planning would happen. So where do I carry out my supply planning? One option is in IBP, we have a response and supply module where you can carry out your supply planning process on the right side here. All those inputs are again going back to supply review. A debate would happen again on the unconstrained demand versus constrained within my supply chain. Will be again discussed with the during the pre-SNOP meeting, and then finally it will be stamped by the supply chain director or financial director. Venkatesh, go ahead, please.
So Sam, the consensus and unconstrained demand are one and the same,
Correct,
right?
correct.
Okay. And another question, so when you say the inventory, right? So the safety stock, yeah, I understand from the warehouse standpoint, we need to maintain certain buffer sensing the like the demand, right? That's one thing. What about like on the distributor side, if you had already shipped some quantities in the previous months and all of them have not been sold, there is some inventory available on the distributor or on the customer side, right? So are we taking into that also into account for our planning purpose, or we are not considering that?
In supply planning part, we do not consider that. The
Okay.
moment stock is dispatched from my customer facing location, it could be main warehouse or regional distribution center, then I do not consider that as part of my supply planning input. It's done.
Mhm.
However, you're right. At some point of stage, that inventory is still going to be consumed and needs to be considered. That would be considered in the sales planning activity where sales rep is working with distributor to understand the inventory lying at his end, right? And come up with the delta forecast. So that input comes during the demand planning process or S&OP demand review process. That when I as a sales rep talking to distributor to understand what is the physical inventory line, let's say 100 pieces, and there are 60 pieces which are in transit, which would be available to distributor in a week or so, let's say, right? So distributor gives me a feedback saying that looking at the sales pattern, looking at the new customer launches and new probably new retailer shops being opened, we foresee additional demand, and then they net off this demand with the existing inventory or the channel inventory, and the delta is provided back to the sales representative indicating this could be the tentative forecast. So that in channel inventory is not going to impact your supply planning as such, but a demand signal in the beginning.
Okay.
Supply
And demand
planning,
sensing,
sorry.
sorry, Sam, to interrupt. So the demand sensing is only meant for like ad hoc sales orders, you mean, or in addition to the ad hoc sales orders, do we consider any other signals?
Yeah, it is not only ad hoc, but it is a regular sales order as well, where you
Okay.
see a pattern on a daily basis or a weekly basis. Normally, in what week of month I try to get tend to get more sales orders, right? And accordingly, system will also guide you to generate your demand within those specific weeks. Normally, otherwise, what normally demand planning team in olden days used to do is use a thumb rule that I carry out my demand planning in a monthly bucket. So I don't care whether my forecast should be in the first week, second week, third week, or fourth week. Okay. I come up with a number saying that I expect 100 pieces would be sold in September. That's the normally demand planning cadence, right? Generating a monthly numbers. That's it. But when you send these numbers to supply planning, you need to have some kind of split logic so that supply planning team can work on a weekly replenishment plan. Supply planning team never work on a monthly numbers. They would try to disaggregate these numbers into weekly buckets and try to come up with the replenishment plan on a weekly basis, or at times on a daily basis also, if based on the industry. But 90% of the organizations you would see supply planning doing in the weekly buckets. So in that case, the question comes, if a demand planning team has done the demand forecasting in a monthly bucket of 100 pieces, when I release this demand to supply, in what proportion I should release this demand? That time, this demand sensing feedback is also become crucial, that look at the sales orders coming in the weekly buckets and split the demand according to those sales order numbers. So that's where this demand sensing input would be acknowledged. Not all organizations are able to do that. With every module, you require a dedicated task force to carry out those operations, those functions. So at times, organization says, I have a thumb rule. My demand team works on a monthly number. I'll split it either equally, or looking at the high level sales pattern. I know most of my sales order come into last week, where my stock is pushed to the distributor, right? So that's where I would keep my forecast always in the last week of the month, and then let supply planning team carry out their replacement plan. That's why you would see there are hardly any implementations under demand sensing area. There are a lot of pilots happening. Organizations are trying to digest this information, right, as a additional value added information. But there is a question that how many organizations are really carrying it out from the usage perspective. Venkatesh, I hope I was able to answer your query.
Yes, Sam. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. So we talked about inventory calculation. We talked about need of supply planning calculation. So SAP said we provide you supply planning algorithms to generate your replenishment plan in two ways. One is time series supply planning, and another is order-based or order series supply planning. So IBP response and supply module is an order-based supply planning module, which will give you the result in terms of planned order, purchase requisition, or stock transfer requisition numbers for specific product to be shipped from specific location or to be produced in specific manufacturing plant, right? Overall, SAP is still trying to mature this module. That's why you would see less number of projects happening in order-based supply planning. But eventually, next year onwards, there could be a good amount of boom here, right? Because organizations would tend to move from APO to any other tools. So, and those feedback will again go back to the supply review and again will become a key input for your constraint demand plan calculation.
Sam, like one more question in this entire process, like who is the like main owner, like the final say, like this is my final consensus demand plan for this month. Is it a marketing team or like demand planning team, supply team? Like who owns the final call?
Yeah, yeah, very valid question. It's a long debate, right? Always. And then every organization will have a dedicated S&OP lead. Okay, it could be global, it could be regional also. Because when we talk about S&OP process, every organization may have their country specific S&OP process first, then a regional S&OP, and then a global S&OP, right? So every organization may have a dedicated S&OP lead who is the final decision maker along with the S&OP director, supply chain director, and finance director. Ultimately, you need a stamp from supply chain director and finance director for sure. But all this process would be managed by the S&OP lead. So at times, an S&OP lead would also understand the comments, feedbacks coming from marketing, coming from demand, coming from sales, and then he or she is able to take a final call. So at times you may say that although demand planning team is coming up with a conservative forecast, however, there is a valid input coming from marketing team that now since we are adding couple of additional product subfamilies within the brand, right? We are anticipating specific surge in specific month or specific quarter, and that input is a valid input. So although there is a conservative focus prediction by demand, I would add these inputs from marketing team on top of the demand signal and consider that as part of my consensus demand. There are certain events from the, let's say, chemical industry perspective, right? The events are launching of some new regulatory products. Your demand team probably will not have that much of insights, whereas the marketing team or the product portfolio managers would, or the commercial team also, would have more insights on when do you anticipate these regulatory approvals and when do you anticipate the launch of these products. So, so it is situation specific, Venkatesh, that how much of those inputs needs to be acknowledged and respected, right? So anyway, it's a consensus discussion again, right? Whereas everybody tries to put up their inputs along with the justifications. Those inputs are 100% leveraged at times or partially leveraged, right? And then getting that input only from the marketing team doesn't mean that we will finalize that demand signal. If I have a regulatory launch coming as a marketing input, that will be also discussed with my supply team to understand. We'll take an example of pharmaceutical industry, right? There is a launch for a specific product family, which requires a critical active ingredient to be available to produce those specific products. And from chemical or pharmaceutical industry perspective, there is a huge lead time to produce these active ingredients or active pharmaceutical ingredients, right? So supply team is the one who is more closer to the reality, whether we will be able to produce those active ingredients in time. Have we also aligned with our suppliers to get the supply of raw materials to produce those active ingredients? Whether my machine capacity, my plant capacity is enough to cover those regulatory launches, and accordingly, S&OP lead would take a final call. So again, here you would see in organization, there would be a requirement for regional or country specific S&OP leads whenever we talk about the S&OP overall cadence.
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
And then the next subsequent part is again on the execution, where the inputs coming from sales team, marketing team, then they result into a sales order execution, right? The supply plan results would then turn into the execution from generating a purchase orders or stock transport orders, and the planned orders in terms of production plan would eventually turn into a production execution in terms of production orders or process orders. This is how a high level visual would be look like if I look at the entire supply chain planning, where I talk about horizontal sales and operations planning process, a dedicated demand planning process, a dedicated demand sensing process, a dedicated supply planning process in conjunction with the safety stock calculation, right? All those inputs in a way will be passed to the S&OP discussions, and the ultimate goal of S&OP would be final constraint demand alignment in alignment with my revenue projections, right? And ultimately, then the execution will happen. And that's why you would see whenever we talk about IBP, you would see those blocks highlighted with a dedicated color to indicate these activities will be mapped as a solution in IBP.
So then Sam, like I'm saying that supplier commit with SAP Ariba. So for IBP to be used, like a client should have Ariba also
It is not mandatory.
implemented. Okay.
Yeah, it is not mandatory. Valid question. I was about to check if anybody would point out this, like why do we see Ariba here? So what SAP said, you can client may use Ariba for their procurement execution processes, whereas the input also need to be aligned in the S&OP or in safety stock calculations. So we will provide you a integration mechanism between IBP. So once the demand is finalized, once the supply plan is uh, being generated, you can have these inputs coming from your suppliers, right? So when you provided the 2 years or 3 years down the line visibility to them, supplier has to also look at the capacity at his or her side, right? Whether I will be able to supply this much of amount of raw material components, AIs to you or not, right? And supplier will commit on those quantities. That input can also be a valid input for me during S&OP. So SAP said, we will give you a flexibility to have an integrated mechanism so that IBP can talk with Ariba and get this information directly available as one of the placeholder in IBP. In reality, in my experience, I haven't worked with this integration. Probably in last 1.5 years back, SAP introduced this, but I haven't seen any active use case from the implementation perspective where we implemented integration with Ariba. But yes, we did a POC just to cross check, yes, how that can be managed, what kind of data services that needs to be created and all. But uh, basically, pass on the message coming from Ariba into IBP so that I as a planner has a visibility to know what numbers my supplier has committed, right? So this is how the different models within IBP would look like. Now I just stop
And one
sharing.
more thing, Sam, so you have this response planning also, right? So that is a separate module within SAP, or it's just a terminology within the IBP process?
Yeah, it's a separate model altogether. Basically, what SAP said in APO world, it was only supply planning, right? But whereas there is a need to look at the supply constraints and then allocate your supply constraints throughout your supply chain, right? If you have a shortage on AI, how are you going to uh, react to that shortage and then allocate those shortages throughout different distribution centers, right? So that every distribution center understands that there is a scarcity of raw material and you're going to only get limited amount of supply. Plus, there are ad hoc sales orders coming into picture. How do you react to those? So SAP said we will also give you additional mechanism to act on it to look at those uh, uh, bottlenecks and allocate and do the allocation using a mechanism called as response planning. And that's why SAP said we will give a combined module of response and supply. Right? So response is more linked towards your sales distribution part, but anyway, it has a linkage with your allocation planning, and that's why it has brought now into a planning domain.
But then, Sam, like how this is different from the demand sensing, right? Even demand sensing also, we are trying to consider the ad hoc sales orders, right? It's basically reacting towards like any uh, like unplanned sales orders coming up on the way. So how we differentiate between the demand sensing concept versus the response planning allocation concept?
Right. So demand sensing is looking at those sales pattern and trying to figure out your focus split in a weekly buckets, right? Based on the actual sales orders which used to come in the past. Whereas response planning is the future oriented look. That is one difference. Second one is demand sensing is able to help you to split that focused numbers. Whereas once everything is done, once these demand numbers are passed to supply planning, and from supply perspective, you have calculated your replenishment plan, saying that for this SKU, I need to replenish 100 pieces in regional distribution center 1, 20 pieces in distribution center 2, 15 3, 14 BC4. However, there is a constraint of active ingredient. Now that means I will not be able to supply these finished goods in the right amount of proportions. Now, in the response and supply planning, what I am trying to do is forget about demand. How do I manage this allocation now of actual supply based on the inventory availability and based on the ad hoc orders coming in the recent future now? And then split my proportions that, okay, instead of 40 pieces to distribution center 1, I need to push more inventory to distribution center 1 rather than distribution center 2. I'm okay to lose sales at distribution center 2, or maybe I I will change the proportions in terms of finished good 1 versus finished good 2. Same active ingredient is being used in finished good 1 and finished good 2. Now let me change the production calculation for finished good 1 and finished good 2, and accordingly change my supply calculations for that also. So response and supply, Venkatesh, is more towards how do I manage the constraint within my supply and try to distribute or redistribute that supply constraint. Whereas demand sensing is guiding you from the demand calculation perspective, looking at the way I used to have my sales orders in past. When I'm generating forecast, I'm not looking for sales orders in future. What I'm saying is, Venkatesh, I would look like a split of sales orders in the past. In August, I'm let's say I'm in September now. In August month and in July month, in reality, I had 20% of sales order in week 1, 20% in week 2, 20% in week 3, and 40% in week 4. That was my split. And looking at that actual split of sales order, you generate the demand signals, right? So when you look at demand sensing, it is more to generate a forecast based on the pattern of previous weeks or previous months. Whereas when you're talking about supply planning and reacting to those allocations, you are looking at open sales orders coming in reality in future weeks, and then trying to identify if there are any constraints, if you need to do some allocations and carry out from the supply perspective.
Yeah, clear, Sam. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Again, I mean, I understand team, probably these are all complex topics and it will take a lot of time for us also to get expertise on those. Right now, we will only focus on the basics of it, right? As a IBP consultant, how first of all, I would like to learn all the functionalities within IBP to carry out my demand planning. How do I cleanse out my sales history? How do I bring master data into IBP? How do I generate statistical forecast? Which are the additional helping hands available in IBP for me to do this demand review process? How can I generate a simplified supply plan in IBP using time series supply algorithm, and use those inputs during my supply review process. While doing that, what are the additional helping hands available in terms of creating analytical charts, creating dashboards, so that I can use those dashboards during my S&OP meetings, right? Are there any alerts available? Can I configure certain alerts in IBP so that those alerts are helpful for me as a sales team person, as a demand team person, or as a supply team person to indicate or justify my feedback, right? So all those functionalities, very uh, easy to configure functionalities available in IBP, and we'll try to get used to those during our exposure to IBP, right? Now, I'll quickly touch base on the model configuration part. And from next session onwards, we will have the real training sessions, whoever will be enrolled. And we will start the actual IBP model configuration, which is a core key area for us. Let me share my screen. I think I missed it out. So when we talk about IBP, and let's say when we talk about ECC, what we normally tend to get, we tend to get a SAP provided building block, right? For example, if I need to configure a new plant in ECC or S4, do I do that from a scratch? Yes, there is an option. However, SAP said we will give you a standard plant available in ECC. You can copy it and create new one. That's how we used to do it, right? In ECC, right? We never create a plant from scratch. When you do this copy mechanism, there are so many tables available in ECC which are plant specific configurations. Those will be automatically copied over. That means all the dependent configuration will get copied over, right? And then in ECC, you will do this in a specific instance called as client, right? That's how your client specific configuration would exist. In IBP, SAP said, we will give you a similar structure, a placeholder similar to client. You can configure a specific instance called as planning area. So this is a high level umbrella for that organizations under which all the configurations to carry out my S&OP would exist. That means if uh, Venkatesh is implementing IBP S&OP for a specific client, for a specific organization, then first important part to be configured is creating that structure within IBP instance, which is called as planning area. I can create a planning area. That means I can create this client instance from a scratch. Yes, possible. However, SAP said, we will give you again a similar building block so that you don't need to do all these exercises from scratch. This will reduce your implementation time. And that means all the baseline configurations to carry out S&OP, SAP has already thought of and created a reference model using a standard planning area, which is called as, from S&OP perspective, it is called as unified planning area, right? Now, when we talk about S&OP process, we saw it has combination of everything. It has combination of demand module also, supply module also, part of inventory optimization also, right? Part of demand sensing also. Although there are individual modules within IBP, My S&OP partly cover everything, right? So my unified planning area will also have all the configurations to cover part of all these individual modules. Using S&OP planning area within IBP, I can still able to generate my demand. I can still able to generate my supply plan at a rough cut for a rough cut capacity planning perspective and so on, right? And I may have some flexibility to also generate some alerts, etc. That means partly functionalities of all these individual modules are also available in my unified planning area standard configuration. So if a client is only going to implement S&OP, you can refer this unified planning area uh, standard building block and copy it for your client specific naming convention. However, if your client also has statistics expert, they want to leverage the in-depth functionality of demand planning, then client will also have additional licensing for IBP for demand, which will also provide them option or access to all algorithms within demand planning, all complex algorithms within demand planning, and those can be leveraged. So within S&OP, you may have simplified demand planning algorithms, which can help you to generate demand. But if you want to go ahead with deep dive in demand planning, you also need to have separate license for IBP for demand, right? So we as a consultants would also need to know that if client only wants to have S&OP implemented, do they really require IBP for demand license? Not necessary. But if they want to have an in-depth demand planning execution with all complex algorithms of gradient boostings, all AI machine learning techniques, which SAP has provided in recent releases, then they need to have a dedicated IBP for demand license. Right? I'll come back to the topic. If I want to configure S&OP, SAP said we will give you a placeholder. You use that building block and copy to your client specific needs, which is a unified planning area. Why unified? Because it has combination of everything. Right? So again, from configuration perspective, we will focus on planning area configuration. When Sam talk about planning area configuration, what all it includes? If you look at the real-time picture from a planner, let's say Venkatesh is a demand planner. He's going to use this Excel front end, right? And Venkatesh is going to say that my for material one, which I'm going to sell it from my distribution center one to this customer one. I intend to update my sales forecast as an example. Okay, I'm just trying to create a visual how my table would look like. And on column E onwards, I will have months. September, October, November, and so on, right? So Venkatesh needs a view in IBP so that he can put a forecast numbers, input a forecast numbers in this format. December, I tend to have lower sales, so I will have reduced numbers as an example. Right? So he needs an ability in IBP to generate a view. Within that view, I would like to have input at a material location customer level as example for a dedicated purpose of updating my sales forecast in monthly numbers. In IBP term, this specific information is called as, I just copy this. This is one of the example. This entity is called as key figure. people who have worked on BW would have exposure to all these terminologies, right? But in ECC, hardly you would have come across these terminologies, right? So please ask me again, guys, if you do not able to relate to these terminologies. So in a way, sales forecast will be a dedicated placeholder to be available so that Venkatesh can update forecast. This forecast will be easily identified as a sales forecast, right? So Venkatesh is a sales representative member. He will have access to IBP and he should have ability to update the sales forecast numbers at granularity of material, location, and customer as example in a monthly buckets.
Don't forget to subscribe our channel and click on bell icon to update yourself with latest SAP videos.
These numbers in time granularity perspective are part of the time profile configuration. So when you talk about IBP configuration, you are also going to have or decide the time profile, the time granularity details. Right? So we talked about sales forecast, which is called as key figure. We talked as month numbers. It's called as part of my time profile terminology. And then we said, I would be able to update these numbers in months under sales forecast umbrella or placeholder for subset of combination of fields, right? Material number is one of the field, location number is one of the field, customer number is one of the field. So we talk about these fields in ECC also. We are comfortable with those fields, right? Every master data object has its dependent fields available in those respective tables, right? Similarly, in IBP, those fields are called as attributes. Example is material number. All these combinations is part of my planning area architecture. So I need to define my planning area architecture to know how many such kind of placeholders we need to configure in my system so that every respective stakeholder will be able to either display the numbers or edit the numbers. Now, do I only require sales forecast? I may also require information of sales history. This will be another example of key figures. I would, based on the sales history, I would also need an ability to generate the statistical forecast. Can be another placeholder. So if I see a numbers here, now from sales history perspective, I will always see numbers in the past. Right? You can decide till what past version you can have those numbers. And so on. And based on that, I would like to generate my statistical forecast using one of the demand planning functionality so that the statistical forecast would start showing some numbers here based on the algorithm I use. Right? Now looking at this information, I should be able to easily identify what are these numbers related to. These numbers are related to sales forecast inputted by specific person responsible to update sales forecast. These numbers are related to sales history, which is captured in my ECC system and somehow available in IBP, right? So there are integration mechanisms where we will bring this sales history information from ECC to IBP. And maybe always being a demand planner, he has utilized the statistical algorithm execution and based on the sales history, he has come up with the statistical numbers. This is one of the view we will have in IBP. And in order to have this information available, we'll have to first configure what exactly is intended in IBP as part of my planning area configuration. And we will have dedicated time spent on all these configurations, so that unless these configuration topics are clear, you will not be able to understand what exactly happens in SAP. How do I use this information in planning views and so on, right? So I just try to give you some pointers here to understand what we are going to talk in detailed sessions of IBP model configuration, IBP planning area architecture. Right? Now the discussions were getting interested, right? I think people who have not exposure to all this will find, some people may find it more interesting, some people may find it little confusing, but trust me, once we are done with the IBP planning area configuration topics, you will have complete picture of how you are going to design a planning area architecture for any client. With this, we'll take a pause for today. I think today was the last opportunity for us to go through those sessions and decide whether we want to go ahead with the details of the planning area configuration, individual modules within IBP with hands-on, right? So I request you guys to make up your mind by today and let Bhupinder know or the team know, so that we can start the in-depth trainings from the next weekend onwards, right? I think so far 3 or 4 people have already enrolled, and I would like to continue now with those dedicated members uh, with the system deep dive. Any question, team, so far on the topics what we discussed today? If not, then I wish you a good day, and even if you do not interact anymore further, feel free to stay in touch. Thank you all.